All right, I think we have enough people in to kind of get rolling with our introduction. So my name is Shay Quarry, and I serve as the programs manager for the DC Preservation League. I'm joined today by public historian Emma Cieslik and by my coworker Zachary Burt, who is running the live stream on Facebook. If you hear a dog barking, that is Brody. For those of you who may be new to DCPL, we are Washington, D.C.'s citywide nonprofit founded in 1971 that is dedicated to preserving, protecting, and enhancing the historic built environment of the nation's capital. I have just a few things to go over today before we get started. I'd like to start by taking a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top sponsors, whose annual financial support helps underwrite free programs like this one today. They are the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, QTAC Rock, Douglas Development Corporation, Atlantic Refinishing and Restoration, Antunovich Associates, Buyer Blender Bell, EHT Traceries Inc., and KCE Structural Engineers. Thank you all for your dedication to historic preservation in DC. Moving on, just a few notes on how the webinar is going to run. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box found at the bottom of your screen. We'll go through those questions towards the end of the program. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, then you can submit those questions in the comment section, and Zach will forward those to us over here on Zoom. So now that we've covered all of that, I'm so pleased to introduce you to today's speaker, Emma Cieslik. Emma is a queer, neurodivergent public historian, religious scholar, and museum worker based in the Washington, D.C. area. She's passionate about collecting LGBTQ histories, specifically the history of religious liberation alongside religious harm in the nation's capital. She currently serves as historian for Center Faith's Pride Interfaith Service, and last Pride she published a digital exhibit on DC's LGBTQ religious history for the Rainbow History Project. She's written a series on DC's LGBTQ history for the Washington Blade. So she's written on a lot of different topics, from the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence in the Lavender Mass to the Washington Area Council on Religion and the Homosexual to Gay Pride Week. So she's done a lot of work in the area, and we're so happy to have her here sharing her expertise on this subject. So Emma, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. During the session, I'm going to begin by intentionally seeking to create an accessible and inclusive environment. For me, that means beginning the presentation with an audio description for individuals who are low vision or blind, or seeking other types of sensory information. Thank you for joining me today. It's wonderful to meet you all. My name is Emma Cieslik, and as Shay said, I am a lesbian, neurodivergent, and disabled museum worker and public historian based in the Washington, D.C. area. I am a Rainbow History Project researcher focused on LGBTQ+ religious history, and for the past 2 years have served as historian for the Pride Interfaith Service. I'm a white woman with brown shoulder-length hair, currently pulled back into a ponytail. I have dark brown eyes and dimples. I'm wearing thin wire-rimmed glasses and a black blouse with red patterning on it. I am seated against a soft gray wall with a chest of drawers behind me. You may see my kitten, her name is Nell, pop up on the camera. I have her all situated in a different part of the room, but she might pop in just to say hello. She is an orange and white striped cat who's about 9 months old, and she loves to say hello. Hello. So as in orienting and setting up and establishing this presentation, as Shay said, we aim for this presentation to include meaningful questions and answers afterwards. I also hope to communicate to everyone listening that this history is collaborative and it's constantly being collected. So much of LGBTQ+ history, and specifically LGBTQ+ religious history, has not been recorded, or what has been recorded has been destroyed as a result of violent queerphobia. Some often in the context of religious violent queerphobia, which is incredibly important to the discussion today. So this event uses as its foundation a preliminary timeline of LGBTQ+ religious history. But this timeline, like much of existing LGBTQ+ historical materials, remains incomplete. As I said before, this is the direct result of violent queerphobia that stopped the creation and destroyed records about LGBTQ+ people. This presentation and my own historical research is an exercise in historical activism, in gathering and preserving the stories of our own community in our own voices. As a result, I am hoping to orient this session around acknowledging that this work may never be finished. This work is collaborative, and this work is a community effort. This presentation invites all of you to engage with content by adding your own histories in the Q&A session as you're asking questions, or by sharing your own stories and historical material after the presentation. More to come on this at the end. So an important note before starting that I always like to emphasize is for anyone who signed up for this session or anyone who's joining us now who just happened upon Facebook or online on the DC Preservation League website, is that this history will specifically start around the 1960s. It orients itself around this time period specifically because many previous late 20th century and some early 21st century scholars associate the development and the starting point for the LGBTQ plus rights movement as the Stonewall riots in 1969 in New York City. But as many queer scholars are developing today, especially queer scholars of color and queer scholars who are disabled and are Indigenous, this history of American queer identity predates the 1960s. It even predates the country of the United States itself. So this history did not start in the 1960s, even though I'm going to orient what I have based on accessible records in this time frame moving forward. LGBTQ plus people have led, pioneered, and enriched communities of faith ever since these communities have existed, just as LGBTQ plus individuals have been key contributors to the history of the United States Capitol. One good example that you see on the right of your screen is William Dorsey Swan, a formerly enslaved man bedecked in drag. He hosted private balls known as drags in secret in 1880s DC. Swan is shown in the photograph on the screen, wearing a large flayed out woven hat and a long multi-layered dress. Swan is now recognized as the first self-proclaimed American drag queen. And Swan and his 12 siblings were baptized Catholic and confirmed in the church on orders of Anne Murray, who claimed him and his siblings as her property, now recognized as incredibly problematic and incredibly harmful. Although his father and mother were both Protestant, and religion remained a key part of his life growing up and his associations with DC's Black community. Who you'll spot in the lower left-hand corner is somebody that's not necessarily specific to DC. This is the universal public friend. This is an individual who, although being born with a specific gender, transitioned during life and lived with that identity and those pronouns and that chosen name after what many describe as a coming to understand a reversion experience, or what she considered a coming to God. As a result of this experience, this is one of the first, if not the first, self-described individual who remained a religious leader in the community, established their own religious community, and also was publicly LGBTQ+, although they wouldn't have used that term then at the time. So starting off the presentation as we go along, this will cover a timeline of events happening around the DC area. My goal with this is to orient what is happening in DC during these specific time periods and also to tie together overarching themes about DC's LGBTQ plus history. So one of these specifically is going to focus on change and establishing. Get out of here now. One of these is gonna, sorry about that, everyone. One of these is gonna focus on queer affirming communities and establishing discussion groups and conferences focused on LGBTQ plus religious identity. The second one is gonna focus mainly on different examples of activism and ministry during the AIDS crisis, as well as responding to different criticism of the LGBTQ plus community oriented from religious ones. And finally, we're going to focus on how today many LGBTQ plus people are reclaiming these specific communities for their own benefit and reclaiming religious heritage as a form of liberation. So to start out, in 1961, Frank Kameny founded the Mattachine Society of Washington. So one thing specific about the Mattachine Society, whether or not you're familiar with it, is that this specific society was set apart during a time when there was intense LGBTQ plus persecution. Although traditionally this association was based on the West Coast and was mainly focused on white cis gay men who were part of this organization, it's important to note that their work was some of the earliest focused on LGBTQ plus religious organizations and formal documentation. It doesn't mean they were the first ones to exist, but Frank Kameny was instrumental in creating this community that actually met at St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., which provided space. One thing that set the Mattachine Society apart was the focus on the pronunciation of the name during a time of increased secrecy and worry about being exposed, especially in the Capitol, where during this time of McCarthyism, individuals who worked for the United States government were persecuted and could lose their jobs, their livelihoods, as well as their families as a result of being outed. This organization used the pronunciation of its name as a gatekeeping mechanism to keep its members safe. Further, Washington's Mattachine Society chapter founded the Washington Area Council on Religion and the Homosexual in 1963. So this group was founded by Jack Nichols and Frank Kameny. Jack Nichols was then only 23 years old, and it served as a Mattachine Society chapter committee. So this group adopted in their formal constitution in December 1965 the purpose of affecting the integration of the individual homosexual into the religious life of the community by alleviation of the estrangement and alienation which now exists between the homosexual and the religious community. This is a theme that we'll see referenced over and over again throughout this history of mainly LGBTQ plus communities reaching out to religious leaders and religious institutions and organizations for forms of partnership, as well as cementing their relationship with these communities for support and public recognition. Then in March 1965, the leaders of the Mattachine Society, specifically Frank Kameny, brought together DC clergymen to a conference on LGBTQ plus identity and faith. So Kameny, who founded the Washington Mattachine Society, brought together leaders from Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish communities throughout the DC area. This conference was actually held at American University on March 22nd. And was instrumental in moving forward to create and establish this specific committee into a formal working group moving forward. Who you see on your screen presenting somebody currently dressed in uniform is Frank Kameny with a small circular button on his upper left lapel. And then in 1967, Nichols and the Reverend Lori Graham answered questions about the LGBTQ plus community for WJZ TV Baltimore. This was an especially critical time, as I mentioned earlier, because public visibility of religious support for LGBTQ plus identity, public rights, as well as acceptance and livelihoods was critical, especially in a community and in a country where religion was often conflated as the major justification for anti-LGBTQ plus thought and violence. Now, Reverend Graham was a chaplain at American University, and in speaking with the specific news group, had shared that LGBTQ plus communities were critical to reach out to because they were deemed the second largest minority. During this session, they answered questions from the host and the audience, explaining that homosexuality was not a pathogen or a pathology, another theme that will come up later in discussion of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. As one reviewer shared, especially Nichols himself, in reflection of the conversation that he had with Graham, the significance of this show lies in the fact that for the first time, a distinguished Methodist clergyman on the East Coast has publicly associated himself with the civil libertarian aims of the homophile movement and has made his views known to a wider television audience. This would later be followed by something well recognized, specifically bringing together major religious leaders in conversation with individuals who were positive or are positive for HIV, in conversation with one another, in communication about the importance of their own rights, but also access to appropriate and affirming healthcare. Sorry about that, you all. So in 1975, DC hosted the first, let me go back for a second. DC hosted the first Gay Pride Day. So this was the first officially recognized Pride celebration in DC. The event followed in the footsteps of the 1972 Gay Pride Week, organized by Chuck Hall, Bruce Pennington, and Cade Ware. So Gay Activists Alliance President Bob Carpenter and Deacon McAbin planned the first Pride event specific to the city. And later on, I'll discuss why this is significant in 1976 because of its overlap with Father's Day and how this complicated relationships between the LGBTQ plus community and DC's Catholic leadership. By the mid-1970s, especially, the Friends Meeting of Washington was founded. So in the mid-1970s, this Quaker worship house provided space for the lesbian-run Rising Women's Coffee House at its Decatur Street building. The George Washington University collection even has some photos from this specific space, including signs they created as part of their activism work, although I couldn't get a photo of it for this presentation. In the 1980s, this worship house hosted meetings for LGBTQ plus individuals hoping to worship in the Quaker tradition. And from 1987 to 2010, weekly HIV and AIDS coffee houses sessions were held for those affected by HIV and AIDS for communal support as well as religious ministry. In 1975, one community, Bet Mishpachah, was founded in DC. This was founded in partnership with the Metropolitan Community Temple with the support of the MCC DC. The synagogue hosted the first international conference of gay and lesbian Jews just a year after it was founded in 1976. This was especially instrumental later, as I'll discuss, in the most recent iteration of the Pride Interfaith Service, where Alan Armas, who was critical to this community as well as other LGBTQ plus affirming Jewish communities around the DC area, was memorialized. In 1976, as I mentioned earlier, the Gay Pride Day fell on Father's Day. In 1976, this fell on the same day when many Catholic institutions and churches throughout the area were hosting their annual Father's Day Mass, and several Catholic priests in the area were upset by this. In response, LGBTQ plus community representative David L. Aiken spoke out in a letter to the editor of the Washington Star. Quote, gays do not threaten fatherhood, motherhood, or any other traditional values. What gay pride does challenge, however, is the bigoted assumption that heterosexual relations are the only kind about which is polite to speak. And this would be critical moving forward, especially thinking to the most recent iteration of the Pride Interfaith Service, with one representative coming from affirming LGBTQ plus family organizations that focus on celebrating and creating and allowing families to access resources for families of all different shapes and sizes, as well as chosen families. And then in 1979, significantly, Pope John Paul II was met by Dignity and Washington chapter members within his mass that he performed upon arriving in the United States. This was especially critical and poignant for the meaning that it had for people throughout the DC area. I mention this because about 8 years prior, Dignity and Washington was founded at the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception's cafeteria. Now, in 1979, Pope John Paul II's Mass was held at St. Matthew's downtown. But at this specific earlier 8-year prior establishment, this group, established by 6 individuals who were meeting, including Sister Janine Gramick, Patrick Mills, Father Greg Slamone, Glo Cicero, and another individual, saw the need for a queer Catholic ministry and started the chapter. Subsequently, this chapter was very quickly involved in activism when the Pope arrived to say Mass on Saturday, October 6th, 1979. 30 members of the chapter greeted him with a banner reading, "Dignity, gay and lesbian Catholics welcome you." It was also addressed quite heavily in the newspapers as a result of the controversy that it caused, but also the meaningfulness in creating visibility for LGBTQ plus Catholics. And soon after, in 1979, Imam Dayi Abdullah moves to Washington, D.C. Imam Abdullah moved to D.C. after helping to coordinate the National March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights. His research of the Quran in Saudi Arabia previously cemented his positive interpretation of homosexuality in the Islamic holy text. He subsequently founded an organization known as the Mosque for Enlightenment and Reformation, or the Light of Reform Mosque, in affiliation with the Prayer Circle of Toronto and Muslims for Progressive Values, who were also present at the Pride Interfaith service, with the intention of creating community and resources for LGBTQ plus Muslims throughout the DC area. This organization is still in production and still alive today. In 1982, however, begins a formal introduction to and greater awareness of the HIV and AIDS pandemic during this time period. As a result, it's important to consider the impact, both positive and negative, that religious communities, in concert with LGBTQ plus individuals and activists, had on centering the care of LGBTQ plus individuals and foregrounding the healthcare and research needed to address and mitigate the disease. So the Metropolitan Community Church of DC partnered with hospitals and medical research institutions in 1982 to host the first AIDS forums in the nation. So the Metropolitan Community Church of DC brought together the Whitman Walker Clinic, the NIH, MCC Baltimore, and Georgetown University Hospital for these forums that was actually held within a religious space, the community church itself, to establish some of those first relationships. MCC would also be a critical space for long-term and proactive healthcare and activism within the community during the crisis. And similarly, this year is quite big, so I have several other points to talk about as well. So in 1982, even though we wouldn't know until 2015 that LGBTQ plus marriage would be legalized in the United States, LGBTQ plus activist Kameny and his partner celebrated a holy union during this time. So within these congregations, LGBTQ plus individuals, especially people who had pioneered these communities, were celebrated. Kameny married his partner, Jim Bennett, as one of the first couples who were celebrating a religious holy union, and as the second couple to be registered as domestic partners within Washington, D.C. You see Kameny on your screen to the right, wearing a t-shirt that says, "If it weren't for me, you wouldn't be normal." In 1982, Reverend James S. Tinney founded Faith Temple. So this is especially significant because it's incorporating ideas and understandings of religious persecution within these spaces. So Reverend James S. Tinney founded Faith Temple, a Black gay Pentecostal church, and led this community as pastor and leader until 1988. He founded Faith Temple after he was publicly renounced by the Church of God in Christ, where he was previously serving as a pastor. Neil Miller, in his text In Search of Gay America, in 1989, interviewed Tinney about why it was so important to him for Black LGBTQ plus people to have their own church space. This specifically addressed the concept that many MCC communities, both in DC, Baltimore, and Northern Virginia, as well as Dignity, Washington, were mainly white associated and white predominant groups. Mainly all of the people who were associated with these communities were doing important work, but were not as either culturally or racially or ethnically diverse. And so, as Tinney said, Black gays couldn't be open in Black churches. On the other, they didn't feel comfortable in the Washington area's largely white MCC churches, necessitating the creation of a new one. So that same year, Elder Robert Michael Van Zandt greeted visitors outside of the Temple Church of God in Christ. This precipitates the creation of Faith Temple itself and was discussed at the recent Pride Interfaith service. So on Sunday, September 9th, 1982, Reverend Van Zandt, one of the pioneers of the Pride Interfaith service, recounted his own journey from a fundamentalist rural Southern community to the steps of Temple Church of God in Christ in Washington, D.C. He and 16 others embraced being same-gender loving and created a gathering of predominantly people of color called a Third World Gathering to create a community for our sacred selves. He held a sign that read, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all people." Isaiah 56 and Mark 11:17. This came about after Dr. James Tenney was told by the bishop that by including LGBTQ plus individuals at All Souls Church DC, he had excommunicated himself. The bishop warned that Tenney's problem was that he had no shame, so the group gathered that Sunday morning before and after church, quote, bearing witness that we lived our lives without shame. And thus Faith Temple was born. 1 year later, I know that was a lot for 1982, but it was an especially significant year. 1 year later, Westminster Presbyterian became the first of 13 congregations to form More Light Network. In 1983, it became one of the first specific congregations to the DC area to become affiliated with this network in partnership and in support of the LGBTQ plus community. This specific congregation openly shared, as it had since the early 1960s, that it fought for the inclusion of an end of discrimination against the LGBTQ plus family. We do not just accept, but celebrate the gifts God has given through our varied sexual orientations and gendered understandings. This would precipitate further, especially in the late 1990s and early 2000s, as we'll see, the development and proclamation of open and affirming churches, including many that were part of this network. In 1984, artist Andrew Hudson organized and led Mintwood Zendo. So from 1982 to 2012, artist Andrew Hudson led the specific community for Soho Zen Buddhist LGBTQ plus practitioners in his Adams Morgan apartment. DC also hosts other LGBTQ plus Buddhist communities, including a chapter of Saka Gakka International USA and an LGBTQ plus inclusive Buddhist group, the Insight Meditation Community of Washington. Both this, along with the Faith Temple, as well as talking about Muslims of progressive values, is critical to recognize that DC's religious LGBTQ plus history is not only white, but also not only specific to Abrahamic faiths. As I'll explore a little bit later, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and especially in the late 2020s, it's critical to understand that many different faith communities outside of streamlined Christianity, outside of streamlined contemporary Judaism, were critical in pioneering LGBTQ plus religious liberation and LGBTQ plus activism in the area. By 1985, the United Church of Christ became an open and affirming parish, along with other communities, as I mentioned earlier. So as a result of this, it was the first of 15 certified open and affirming congregations in the United States. And as a result, declared themselves open and affirming after a period of dialogue and reflection, a process that's still used today for parishes to discern whether or not they want to take that tangible step. By 1986, again returning to our discussion of Catholic history, the National Cathedral began its ministry for people with HIV and AIDS. This year, the cathedral hosted a conference to address how religion and religious communities can serve as allies and caregivers. The cathedral also displayed the HIV and AIDS memorial quilt and organized services around the memorial in 1988, the same year the quilt went to the national tour. The cathedral also hosted services oriented around HIV and AIDS care in 1990, 1993, 1994, and 1996. The National Cathedral would also host pieces of the quilt itself again in 2012. What you see on the screen currently is a group of different religious leaders from across the DC area praying over one segment or one patch of the AIDS memorial quilt. Similarly, you see on the left side of your screen now a piece of the AIDS memorial quilt hung within the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. So in 1991, the NAMES Project Chapter and Clergy Commission on AIDS coordinated the display of AIDS quilts in DMV churches. This chapter and the commission coordinated the display of pieces of this memorial quilt at different DMV churches, from St. Augustine Catholic Church to New Bethel Baptist Church to the National Cathedral itself. This was especially significant and important, as currently now several pieces of this quilt itself are part of different communities' museums based in the Washington, D.C. area. In 1993, Bishop Kwabena Rainier Cheeks became the founding pastor of Inner Light Ministries, a specifically African-American Christian community fighting for the freedom of all people, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, class, or age. Reverend Cheeks founded Us Helping Us, an organization committed to meeting the needs of the Black LGBTQ+ community during the AIDS crisis. This was especially impactful moving forward as Cheeks became a nationwide LGBTQ+ religious leader in his work to pioneer LGBTQ+ change and activism, as well as religious activism within the DC community. You see him on the right side of your screen standing before the Supreme Court. And to my favorite segment of the presentation, looking forward. So not only thinking in review of what we've discussed so far, of the establishment of committees, conferences, and conversations about LGBTQ+ religion in the DC area, then to transitioning to critical moments where religious communities and LGBTQ+ individuals have partnered together in support during times of crisis, to communities in response to either not coming out and supporting individuals or maintaining their support as open and affirming congregations, to finally new religious developments throughout the DC area and throughout the country that migrated to the DC area and established in this community that are specifically oriented around queer religious liberation. One of my absolute favorites is the DC Radical Faeries chapter that was founded in 1977. The most recent DC chapter was founded during this time period, although DC has hosted several different chapters over time. As two of the organization's founders, Donald Kiefner and Harry Hayes, shared, the Radical Faeries, quote, would not only be political and social, but would also address the emergence of gay-centered spirituality and consciousness, a specific religious community that was set out to care for the needs of LGBTQ+ individuals outside of mainstream Christianity, outside of the MCC-DC, which was another one of those communities established by and for DC's LGBTQ+ religious community. Similarly, in 1998, the DC chapter of Al-Fatiha Foundation was established. So it was established by Faisal Alam in 1997 as an organization committed to LGBTQ+ Muslims and their friends and chosen families. This DC chapter was established after the first international retreat for GLBT Muslims was held in Boston in October 1998, and it remained active until 2001. This was one specific example of the establishment of LGBTQ+ Muslim communities. Mentioned previously, another specific community was established and is still in prominence and working today. Then, as we hit the new millennia, Reverend Troy Perry speaks at the Millennium March for Equality. So at this past Pride Interfaith service, Reverend Kathy Alexander, Associate Pastor at the Metropolitan Community Church of Washington, D.C., quoted Reverend Perry, founder of the first MCC church in 1968 on the West Coast, during the March for Equality. Quote, we must not rest until hatred and prejudice are banished from our vocabularies. We must not rest until the doors of all churches and temples and houses of faith open wide and welcome to all people. He ushered in a time of increased inclusion and acceptance within specific DC religious communities, but also a time where religious communities were increasingly called to take a stance and to affirm their accessibility and inclusion to LGBTQ plus members. Subsequently, in 2001, Bruce Pennington, shown on the right side of the screen in drag as Aurora Borealis, hosted, quote, Creating Communities of Faith panel. In December of this year, Pennington hosted this discussion featuring Faisal Alam, previously from the LGBTQ plus Muslim organization, Jerry Goldberg, Andrew Hudson, Bob Malovich, Dan Shellhorn, and Michael Van Zandt. By 2011, Dignity Washington hosted the National Convention on Dignity USA in DC, so all the way from the 1970s to present. And at this convention, 4 long-term Dignity couples from across the United States were married by Dignity Washington members under the DC marriage equality laws, a full 4 years before marriage equality would be achieved in the United States. This remains especially significant since the Catholic Church itself, including Catholic communities and Catholic leadership at the national level, but also on the DC level, continue to orient against LGBTQ plus marriage. Most recently, there has been shift on the motivation and the intention of Pope Francis towards blessing same-sex unions, but he was very specific that this isn't the same or in any way associated with marriage equality. As a result, this is a momentous step that pushed the DC community further and represented how it revolutionized and pioneered LGBTQ plus religious marriage equality and recognition. This would come full circle when the Georgetown University campus chapel would host Pride masses previously for the last, I believe, 4 or 5 years to signal the importance of their support to the LGBTQ plus community. It even went so far as last year, there were a number of protesters protesting this event as well. But thankfully this year there were no protesters, and it was a wonderful service that responded to present movements within the Catholic Church. As you can probably tell, my focus, as well as my background, is in LGBTQ plus Catholic experiences. So that's where a lot of my background knowledge, but also contextualization with wider church movements comes from. So in 2013, following up on our discussions of radical theories, Circle Sanctuary founder Reverend Selena Fox attended a marriage equality rally. In 2011, Circle Sanctuary ministers Jeanette and David Ewing founded the Potomac Circle Ministries in Northern Virginia to minister to pagans in the DMV area. In 2019, faith leaders gathered together in front of the Supreme Court for the Move On rally. This group gathered right as the Supreme Court heard a case that would overturn LGBTQ plus individuals' right to work and allow employers to fire someone because they are LGBTQ plus. As a result, faith leaders from across the DC community, as you can see in this photo, with individuals in their specific clergy clothing, as well as rainbow attire, marching in favor of faith for equality. And by 2022, as we were still in the thick of the COVID-19 pandemic and right after seeing the overturn of Roe v. Wade, the DC House of Perpetual Indulgence for the DC Sisters was hosting its 5th annual Lavender Mass. So the DC House of Perpetual Indulgence was founded and approved by the United Nuns Privy Council in April 2016. The DC Sisters is part of a larger organization that was originally based on the West Coast, where members of the LGBTQ plus community dressed up in nun drag and moved throughout the city. What this would establish was a larger organization committed to activism through the image of LGBTQ plus nuns. And very much in the same line of things, they uphold the mission of women religious and people religious to further their community's rights, as well as the support of individuals who are especially in need. As a result, the DC sisters gathered together on October 8th, 2022, in part of this service that affirmed the importance of reproductive rights for LGBTQ plus individuals, therefore affirming that reproductive rights are critical to all people, not just people that are traditionally identified as women. Sister Mary Full of Rage created this counter narrative originally to the Red Mass, a Catholic Mass that's typically held around the same time on the first Sunday in October to honor Catholics in positions of civil authority. It was especially critical during this time period to unsettle this idea because many people who attend the Red Mass sit in seats on the Supreme Court. And thus, immediately after the overturn of Roe v. Wade, there was a striking counter narrative. This event was specifically supposed to happen at the Memorial of Nuns on the Battlefield, but ended up taking place on a park just a block away from where the March for Reproductive Rights occurred. Especially meaningful. And in 2023, I think it's incredibly important to acknowledge that while we have discussed previously instances of organized religious communities or instances of unorganized religious communities that have come together in forms of leadership and hierarchy, that many LGBTQ plus religious experiences are not confined to formal worship spaces, specific hierarchy community leaderships, or specific institutions with their own formal bylaws. In fact, as a result of systematic homophobia and queerphobia among religious institutions, it's especially important that LGBTQ plus people connect with religious imagery and reclaim religious symbolism within their own spaces on their own terms. One of my best and favorite examples is Shaquita Lee, originally from Gretna, Virginia, hosts drag brunches featuring gospel classics at Crazy Aunt Helen's. This was especially prominent in fall 2023, and cocktails were provided at the event with especially creative and amazing names. Several called the Gospel of Shaquita Lee, Bottomless Jesus Juice, Let the Lord Lay You Down, Blood on the Cross, and Fighting Temptation. Specifically, more recently, both at the same time period in fall 2023, and even today into spring 2024, Trade Bar DC has been instrumental in hosting church services that feature performance spaces for drag as well as rave spaces where LGBTQ plus individuals can encounter and embrace religious symbols and claim them on their own terms in different spaces from a traditional worship space, a church, a mosque, a synagogue, or somewhere out in nature to somewhere that's specifically created by and for the community. And then that brings us to present. In 2024, literally just 2 weeks ago, the Pride Interfaith Service Memorial was held. This year's service remembered and celebrated the life of Alan Armas, co-founder of the Pride Interfaith Service, who died this past October. Friends and family shared memories of Armas and how he was instrumental in providing funeral services for LGBTQ plus Jewish individuals and their chosen families. This is especially important as I skillfully switch to the next element of my presentation because it highlights how many individuals who were involved in this history, many pioneers of LGBTQ plus religious history in the United States, are largely passing on, shifting on from this world. And very much so as a result of violent queerphobia, these histories have not been recorded, or if they were recorded, they were recorded in secret and kept or destroyed as a result of keeping people safe. But it's a critical time right now to record this history for longevity before more individuals pass on and carry their stories with them. So much of this history remains undocumented because of religious queerphobia and the persecution of LGBTQ plus led and inclusive religious communities. So we really need your help. If you have any materials from your religious community, a friend, an ancestor, please reach out to me at eocieslik@gmail.com. I'm eager to highlight archival materials, photos, newspaper clippings, organizational records, and more. I also acknowledge that not all of this history exists in a written format. For reasons that we've covered during this presentation, maintaining this history, maintaining attendance lists, maintaining documentation of Even today, drag gospel services and drag church is markedly unsafe for LGBTQ plus individuals. As a result, it's critical to employ oral history interviews to allow LGBTQ plus community members to tell their own stories on their own terms. If you're more interested to participate in an oral history interview, or if you just want to learn more about what the process would look like or recommend another person for the interview, be careful not to out that person without their permission. Please reach out to me at the email that I provided above. Within this same line of reasoning, the Rainbow History Project, which is a local DC-based LGBTQ plus initiative, is eager to develop an exhibit about DC's history for the 2025 World Pride that's going to be hosted in DC next June. My goal is to incorporate this history about LGBTQ plus religious communities, leaders, and pioneers into this exhibit for World Pride, highlighting how Washington, D.C. has been a leader in LGBTQ plus religious movements, while also a space of religious queerphobia, an important nuance and dichotomy, as well as oxymoron that persists to this day. If you would like to become more involved in the World Pride exhibit and contribute, I would love to share more information with you. I've included this on this slide here, and you can pause the recording for more information, but I'll also verbalize it for you. So our exhibits are very much in need of visuals. As I've discovered in recording this history and capturing it, there's a number of old photos and images, newspaper clippings, personal diaries, as well as recorded interviews that exist in private collections, but largely for the reasons we discussed of personal safety, have not entered public ones yet. If you would like to share an image, please take a picture of the image with your phone and upload it to the Rainbow History Project's Google Photos account. I've included the email address for Colette at the Rainbow History Project below. We also need testimonials. As I mentioned above, oral history is a great way to ensure that LGBTQ plus individuals are telling their own stories on their own terms and their own voices. If you would be interested in sharing more about your memories of LGBTQ plus religious history, or if you'd like to record interviews, recommend people to participate, or would like to find press coverage and other historic writings for conversation pieces in these interviews, please reach out to Will and Delaney from the Rainbow History Project in the email provided on the slide. And finally, exhibits need collections. If you have documents, magazines, newsletters, paperwork, audiovisual recordings, ephemera, old copies of one magazine, especially the 1960 copy that was titled Homosexual, a Servant of God. One of them is in the copy and collection of the National Museum of the American History. We would be interested in learning more. I do not make those decisions whatsoever, but it's important and critical to reach out. What information could be especially poignant and useful? A lot of the information that I uncovered as part of this piece is the result of conversations that I had spontaneously with people about what collections and histories exist outside of formal archives. Please reach out to Frankie, Deputy Director of Archiving, and complete the form whose link is shown on the screen above. You can also join the Rainbow History Project mailing list for more up-to-date information. And in closing, I just want to say thank you so much. Special thank to Shay Corey, Programs Manager for the DC Preservation League, for coordinating this event, and to the entire DC Preservation team for going above and beyond to give me the opportunity to share this history with you today. I would also like to spotlight the archivists at the DC Preservation League, the National Museum of American History, the Rainbow History Project, and Center Faith for their incredible work preserving these histories. LGBTQ plus museum workers, public historians, librarians, archivists, and cultural workers are critical to these histories, as well as people who are passionate about recording and documenting what these stories represent and what they can tell us in the future. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was so great. I'm so glad that we got to have you here today. We do have a few a few questions that hopefully we can kind of run through before our time is up. Our first question, which I will let you answer, but I'm gonna add something first before before I let you answer. So we had a question about somebody's asking where they can read more about things discussed today, if there's a website, XYZ. So in terms of LGBTQ history in DC, site-based work, DCPL just published an LGBTQ digital history tour on DC historic sites. So that's available. There's also there's a few different resources created by HABS and a few other resources that deal with LGBTQ history as well. We're also hoping to here at DCPL to do a multiple property document in the future, which could lead to the addition of more LGBTQ landmarks included in the DC inventory and National Register, which would be great, which is a goal of ours. And a lot of that is based on documentation like Emma is doing right now and continuing to research. So Emma, would you have anything outside of, the Rainbow History Project? Is there any other website or resource that you might recommend to people interested, maybe particularly in the religious LGBTQ history?
100%. That's a wonderful question. And that's exactly the reason this past, I believe it was March, I presented at the DC History Conference, which is actually where I met Shay, exploring and documenting this history. And as part of this work, I had the same question. I love going to conferences, I love academic publications, but they're not always super accessible. And they're often something that isn't recorded long-term, especially conferences, versus newspapers and magazines are often what we find in the collection at all time. So I wrote a 3-part series that was published in the Washington Blade on this history, delving deeper into these movements and the themes discussed today. Feel free to take a look. It's a great series that's depicted and shared in bite-sized pieces, again, focusing on those 3 themes from today, but also bringing it more present in into the 2020s and 2024s. I will also say that I recently published a piece in the Washington Blade about the 2024 Pride Interfaith Service. That's a great spot to look to. As the Interfaith Services archivist and public historian, it was a wonderful service this year focused on the radical origins of the Interfaith Service that discussed the history of not only this service itself over time, which actually dates back to the HIV and AIDS crisis, but also exploring how many religious leaders have really pioneered this community work outside of interfaith. So I documented a lot of the conversations that happened, and many of these histories are what I included in the presentation today. So that's a great resource. It's a really good one. I've also shared through the National Museum of American History several blog posts that explore LGBTQ plus religious history, specific either to DC or within the wider community. I wrote a blog post 2 years ago, time is relative now, focused on the specific issue of 1 I mentioned, titled Homosexual, a Servant of God, which was one of the first mainline LGBTQ plus publications to explore religion and spirituality within the community. It's a really poignant issue that I love to highlight. I've also shared more about DC's own LGBTQ plus history with a piece focused on Mame Dennis and Carl Rizzi. So I would love for you to check out those, but also if you're more curious and just want more information, feel free to reach out to me as well. I've really enjoyed this work and feel like I discover information in the most unexpected spots.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Thank you so much. And I can send some links out as well in our follow-up email about, the Rainbow History Project and some of the other resources, Emma, that you mentioned today. Another one of our questions is about, what are you currently working on? What's next for you? Are you researching anything at the moment that you'd be open to sharing with us?
100%, 100%. I love that question. So for me right now, I work as an emerging museum professional at a regional museum specific to the DC area. I work at a history-based institution. So I love working day to day in collections care and preservation. But I also love, outside of this, focusing on curatorial research and writing. So for me, my next goal is to contribute to the World Pride 2025 exhibit and documenting these histories, but also to continue working. I founded an oral history project myself called the Queer and Catholic Oral History Project. It's based out of the Pacific School of Religion on the West Coast. And that project has recorded about 33 interviews with LGBTQ plus individuals across the United States. My goal is to work to ensure that many of those interviews become accessible soon with their own transcripts to share. And I also aim to continue working with the Rainbow History Project to conduct and collect oral history interviews based on these histories. I know there are a number of people who have expressed interest in contributing their stories to the project. And as I have found through this process, many oral histories where I find information are oral histories that were oriented around or spawned by discussions of specific events, specific DC locations, other communities that have overlap with religion and spirituality. So who knows what will come of those new oral history interviews?
I'm sure a lot, and you always find something out in an oral history interview that you didn't know before.
100%.
Well, I guess my other question for you is what oh, it just flew out of my head. Please hold. Oh, what is your favorite, since you know we're a preservation organization, what are some of your favorite places or spaces in DC that are related to LGBTQ history or LGBTQ religious history?
That's a great question. That's a great question. I will immediately highlight the memorial of the nuns on the battlefield. This was traditionally where the previous Lavender Mass ceremonies were held by the DC Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. So big shout out. I love that specific memorial, which actually sits opposite from St. Matthew's, which is the community where Pope John Paul II said Mass that fateful day with people welcoming him to DC's LGBTQ plus community. I would also say I really love, there were previous other spaces in DC. Bet Mishpacha, I love the space that they've established that is based out of a liberal synagogue based around the DuPont Circle system. I also really love previously as well, Georgetown University, their church called Holy Trinity. I could not think of the word for the life of me earlier as I was talking. Holy Trinity is also home to those Pride Masses, which I mentioned, that have done incredible ministry. They're also one of the few Catholic universities that has a dedicated LGBTQ plus student group, as well as a ministry focused on people inside the church. So I will say definitely a big shout out to those specific spaces, but also a big shout out to many histories and spaces of DC drag. As I mentioned earlier with the blog post talking about Beekman House, which was the center point for Mame Dennis, the drag name of Carl Rizzi, which served as one of the key spaces of DC's largest drag dynasty and kind of the epicenter of the Academy of Washington, which was a drag community and circle that persisted to this day, which has been wonderful. So those will be my big spaces to discuss, but there's so much history in this area as well. It's hard to choose one in particular.
We know how it is hard for us to kind of pick our favorite places and spaces. There's so many great ones in DC. But thank you so much for that. And we'll, we're hoping to, I know Emma and I have talked about getting more of those on our digital tour, which is still in progress. But I think we're at 7. So thank you so much, Emma, for being here today. It was a great presentation. And we look forward to, continuing to work with you. There's Brody on the tour. And I hope everybody has a great night.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate you joining me. And apologies again. I think Nell wanted her own little cameo tonight.
It was animal night, apparently, for us.
We
But
would like to be foregrounded. We would like to be focused on.
sometimes it doesn't happen that way. But yeah, it was great. Well, thank you so much. Have a great night.
Thank you all.